If you could please take your seats, we'll be starting again momentarily.
Dorothy? Where's Dorothy? I'll go get one.
Okay, we're ready to begin. Good afternoon again. For those of you who are just joining us, my name is Valerie Paley. I am the director of the Center for Women's History at the New York Historical Society. And I am absolutely delighted to welcome you all to the second annual Diane and Adam E Conference in Women's History. Our next panel is Disciplining Reproduction, the political and legal battles over reproduction. Moving beyond individuals and institutions, our panelists will focus on the historical impact of the law on questions of reproductive justice. The panelists are James Moore, a College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor of History, and Philip H. Knight Professor of Social Sciences at the University of Oregon. The author and editor of 9 books and many articles, Moore has published widely on medico-legal matters, including Abortion in America, The Origins and Evolution of National Policy, 1800 to 1900, Doctors in the Law, Medical Jurisprudence in 19th Century America, and License to Practice. The Supreme Court defines the American medical profession. He has testified twice before the Judiciary Committee of the United States Senate as an expert witness on the history of abortion law, and he was among the principal drafters of the historian's brief in the 1989 Webster case before the Supreme Court. His Abortion in America book was once read into the congressional record, page by page, as the central component of a successful filibuster against pending restrictions on reproduction. Irene Carmon is a journalist and the co-author of the New York Times bestseller Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Described by New York Times as being known for her smarts and feminist bona fides, Carmon has been a national reporter at MSNBC and NBC News, as well as a staff writer at Salon.com and Jezebel.com, covering gender, reproductive rights, and the law. She's a distinguished fellow at the Athena Center for Leadership Studies at Barnard College, and has been a visiting fellow at the program for the study of reproductive justice at Yale Law School. Dorothy Roberts, whom you heard from previously, is author of Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, Shattered Bonds, the Color of Child Welfare, and Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, as well as more than 100 articles and book chapters. Recent recognitions of her work include the Society of Family Planning 2016 Lifetime Achievement Award and the American Psychiatric Association 2015 Solomon Carter Fuller Award. Carol Sanger is the Barbara Ehrenstein Black Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, where she teaches contracts, family law, and research seminars concerning women's reproductive and familial lives. These include Meanings of Motherhood, Legal and Historical Perspectives, co-taught with Alice Kessler Harris, and Abortion, Law in Context. Professor Sanger's scholarship is focused on how law influences family formation, particularly in relationships between mothers and children in such areas as immigration, custody, and adoption. Her new book about the role abortion plays in American culture in women's lives, about abortion terminating pregnancy in 21st century America, will be published at the end of this month by Harvard University Press. Moderator Linda Greenhouse is the Joseph Goldstein Lecturer in Law and Knight Distinguished Journalist in Residence at Yale Law School. She assumed this position in 2009 after a 40-year career at the New York Times, including 30 years covering the United States Supreme Court. She currently writes a bi-weekly op-ed column for the Times website on the court and law. She received numerous journalism awards for her reporting, including a Pulitzer Prize in 1998. She's written widely about reproductive freedom, including a biography of Justice Harry A. Blackmun, a collection of primary source documents now available online called Before Roe v. Wade, Voices That Shaped the Abortion Debate Before the Supreme Court's Ruling, with Reva B. Siegel. Her most recent book is The Burger Court and the Rise of the Judicial Right. Please join me in welcoming Linda, James, Erin, Dorothy, and Carol.
Thank you, Valerie, and as all the previous speakers have said, it's a pleasure to be here and a particular honor to be moderating a panel, this particular panel of people whose works I've read and people who I greatly admire. So thank you, Valerie. I had nothing to do with putting the panel together. We're going to take a slightly different format from the very illuminating panel that came before, and we're going to switch our focus from birth control, contraception, to abortion. And obviously, there's not a bright line in the march of reproductive justice between those two. But that's going to be our focus, and we're kind of a bridge from the past through the present to the future. So I'm going to put 2 questions to our panelists, and they're going to answer them rather briefly. And if we have time at the end of our hour, we'll have a conversation. But I just want to say I'm so thankful to Dorothy Roberts for agreeing to do double duty, and also for a kind of a bridging anecdote that she offered when she talked about the billboards that mysteriously started appearing in 2011, 2012. The most dangerous place for black baby is in the womb. I'm sure Dorothy knows this, but it may interest people to know those billboards were put up by a white guy from Texas who makes his living as a used car dealer. And the cynicism of hijacking historic African-American concerns about sterilization, population control, for use in those very potent billboards is really a little breathtaking. So we'll talk about all of this. But my first question to the panelists anchors us in history. And that is, I'd like each of them to identify what they think is a major or even the major misunderstanding historically of the abortion rights movement, or how we've gotten to where we are today. And I don't know what they're going to say, so we didn't want to leave it in the green room, and I'll be as interested and surprised as you are by their answers. I'll just say about Jim Moore. He's written the Bible, or maybe I shouldn't bring religion into this, about the history of abortion in America. I mean, it's the go-to, it's the gold standard. So I'm particularly interested in what he has to say.
Thank you. I'd like to address a couple of misunderstandings, though I do so from the perspective of centuries rather than decades. And one of those is the widely held notion, promoted, I think, for obvious political reasons, that the Roe decision was some radical departure that somehow opened the floodgates of abortion into a society that had basically always suppressed it and had never seen abortion at that rate before. And that's just demonstrably untrue, because abortion was legal, openly advertised, widely used by American women from the founding of the Republic through the post-Civil War period. It was a major form of what became the demographic decline in the size of American families. It was not criminalized until the 1870s and the 1880s, so that an abortion performed before what was called quickening, the first perception of fetal movement by the mother, was perfectly legal. And it's even arguable that one of the first and most lucrative medical specialties in the country was abortionist. People made large amounts of money. Famously here in New York, Madame Restell, who built a house quite close to the Trump Tower, actually. It was the largest house on Fifth Avenue at the time. So for most of, well, at least the first half of American history, abortion was not a criminal offense. It was criminalized. Another misunderstanding is that it has always been a highly moral, contested, and politicized question. It simply was not in the 19th century. The people who pushed to criminalize it were the American physicians associated with that branch of American medicine that wanted to move towards science and research, the group that becomes the American Medical Association in modern times. They wanted to use the power of the state to gain licensing and to harass the people they considered inferior physicians. One of the tactics they took was to try to criminalize abortion so that the state could go after people performing abortions. Never mind, they were themselves the ones performing most of the abortions. I've looked at every session of every state legislature in the 19th century. I've seen every petition that was put before every state legislature, and every single one of them is from an individual physician associated with the AMA or a medical society. There's not a single petition from the general public. So this is not a criminalization that was pushed by public sentiment. Nor was it a particularly moral issue. The doctors, in their drive to criminalize the practice, wanted badly to enlist the support of the clergy. They were able to gain the support of many Catholic clergy, but the Catholics were still a relatively small minority of all Americans, certainly in the Midwest and other states, and this is all being done state by state. The doctors were very annoyed at the clergy for not getting involved. The Michigan State Medical Society, for example, in 1870 passed a resolution condemning the clergy of our state for not getting involved in what ought to be a moral crusade. Medical societies all over the country stopped giving free service to the local minister and his family, which it used to be sort of a professional courtesy. So it has, the myth that this has always been, it was always illegal in the American past is that. It is a myth. It's a great misunderstanding. And in that regard, to grossly oversimplify these things, these are difficult questions, but in a sense, Roe returned the country to a situation, a legal situation, quite similar to what it had been before the medical drive to criminalize the practice in the 1870s and the 1880s. That is, abortions early in pregnancy are permitted.
Thank you. That's super interesting. And of course, it's a little bit ironic because part of what Roe itself is responding to is not the voices of women. The voices of women are almost absent. If anybody ever picks up Roe against Wade and reads it, which hardly anybody does these days, they will see that it's really responding to the voices of doctors who are saying that they should not face criminal liability for doing what they think is in the best interests of their patients. And there's a there's quite a paternalistic tone to Roe. And the penultimate paragraph famously is, we therefore hold the woman in consultation with her physician can decide to terminate a pregnancy. So it's a kind of very interesting twist.
In that regard, there is a continuity because abortion law in this country has, in an ironic sense, never been, at least legally, focused on women. It is focused on the person who performs the abortion. So it is a form of medical regulation. It's part and parcel of the medical regulatory process.
Thank you. Carol, whose new book is out. I mean, I have a copy of it and I've read it, and it's a really path-breaking study of the role of abortion in the lives of women.
Can I hold it
Beautiful
up?
cover. So I'll turn to you.
The same question. Yes.
Same question for all four of you.
I'm a decade person, not a century person, because I'm a lawyer, not a historian. And the question that I've been asked the most recently in news interviews and so on is, does the appointment of Gorsuch mean that Roe is going to be overturned? Is this what we're facing now, the overturn of Roe? And I want to explain why I think that's a misunderstanding, the complete focus on Roe when people in general talk about abortion and abortion rights. And so I'll give you two reasons why I think it is not, and then one reason why I think it is not the real problem. The two reasons why I think Gorsuch is just one, and it'll take several years before there's enough people to vote against it if they choose to. However, if you come to the question of what the Supreme Court will do, one, you never know. Two, Casey did not overturn Roe because of the doctrine of stare decisis, which said, even though there were justices on the court who said, I would never have voted for Roe had I been on the court then, but I'm on the court now, and a whole generation has come up relying on the right on the right established in Roe. So we can't know how it's going to play out legally. This is a cheerful approach I'm giving you, but okay. So that's one. The other, just from a political point of view, I'm on my second reason, is that I have real doubts about whether the right wants Roe to be overturned and to go back to the days of criminalization. because in some sense, there'll be nothing left to foment about. And abortion is a wonderful issue because whatever you're angry about, whatever sets you off, it's in there. Whether it's judicial activism or promiscuous teens or women's power or women in the workplace, it all can be read right back onto abortion. As we know from one perspective, but people who are looking to be upset, it's the perfect issue. And now that there's same-sex marriage, there's sort of no moral issue out there, unless we're going to squeeze immigration into it that way. But so I think that's a second sort of political factor. But the real reason why this is the wrong question is because Roe, it was not the case that did so much. Roe was not the case that diminished diminished women's access to abortion. And who in the last panel was talking about Linda, the Texas statute.
Right.
So the real problem is a case that came 20 years after Roe called Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And that case made a big fuss about saying, we're not overturning Roe. No one has anything to worry about. Forget the man behind the curtain. That sort of, don't worry, we're affirming the basic holding in Roe. But what they meant by that was that they weren't going to recriminalize abortion. What they did go on to say then was, however, we think the Supreme Court got some things wrong in Roe. And one of those was that it underappreciated the state's interest in potential life. And so the Casey case from 1992 said, states, you can start regulating abortion from the moment of conception. And those are the kind of laws we've been seeing. It also expanded what counted as health to include mental health. And it also presupposed that abortion ruins a woman's life, and the more that can be done to help her see the right way, see the right outcome is what state laws can enact. And so that's the avalanche of legislation we've seen since 1992. Waiting periods, mandatory ultrasound, doctors having to read you a script, pointing out to you that's the head, those are the limbs, that's the heart, and those are the ones that continue to show women you're bad if you do this, you're killing a person, can't you see it right there? And so what wouldn't be hard to do is so we have Roe in 1993, we have Casey in 1992, and then we have the one happy day that women had over the whole last year, which was in June of 2016 when the whole women's health decision came down, which said, and thank you to the Center for Reproductive Rights and others, which said, wait a minute, we're taking Casey seriously. And we're saying that if the state enacts restrictions on abortion, they have to be related to women's health. And then they showed that physician visiting privileges were not related to health. And that, what was the other one? The size of the aisles. Every abortion clinic had to meet the requirements of an ambulatory surgical center. And so they said, no, those aren't related to women's health. And I think in that case, the doctors got left out. And I mean, it wasn't a doctor-women case. I think that decision put women much more in the forefront. And one of the really charming things about the decision was there's no mention of fetuses at all. It's all about women's health. And so I think that was just a joyous day when that case came down. And so my bad news is, and the misunderstanding is, it would not be that hard to cabin that case and to pull back from that case and to say it was limited to those kinds of issues, and that maybe states can decide what the facts are. Because one of the big misunderstandings we're in a new world where what facts are, we're not sure what they are. And so I wrote down a note, what is a fact? A true statement. And so under Casey, the states could enact legislation based on what they thought was true, not necessarily on true proven statements. And the glory of whole women's health was that it said you have to show that this is related to women's health. And that's where I think the room is to knock us back a bit. And so to take people back to the bad old days of Casey for the next couple of years would be bad enough.
Okay, save that thought, because that's going to be a segue into the second question I'm going to put to everybody, which is what are the paths forward from now. But Dorothy, now it's your turn.
Well, first I want to say I did not bring my 20th anniversary edition of Killing the Black Body, but it was released in February, so here it is. The misunderstanding, historical misunderstanding that relates to the way we think about the law of abortion that I want to mention is the misunderstanding of the mainstream reproductive rights movement that choice as a framework would be effective in achieving true reproductive freedom and justice. Now, the idea that what reproductive rights are about is protecting women's choice to have an abortion. And that has restricted the power of the movement for reproductive freedom in a number of ways, but I'll just mention 3 of them. One is the way in which it has focused on the interests and concerns of middle-class white women who have more of an ability to make choices about their bodies and their access to health care than many women do, who just don't have the resources and the privileges to make those real choices for themselves. And this focus on white women's, middle-class women especially, interests has led to misunderstandings between those women and women who are advocating for a broader range of reproductive freedoms, including the freedom from coerced birth control and sterilization. So in the 1970s, for example, there was a time when women of color were advocating for regulations to protect against abusive sterilization, and organizations like Planned Parenthood and NARAL were advocating against those regulations because white women were experiencing barriers to getting sterilized, whereas black women, Native American women, Latino women were experiencing forced sterilization. The other implication of this is that it has focused on, choice has focused on opposing restrictions on, state restrictions on abortion, as opposed to a more robust advocacy for the resources and social conditions that women need for true reproductive freedom. So for example, much more focus on opposing bans on abortion than on the Hyde Amendment, which denies funding for abortion except in very, very limited circumstances. Still exists today. The US Supreme Court has affirmed the constitutionality of the Hyde Amendment, even though it clearly discriminates against women's health needs on the basis of gender. But there is advocacy against the amendment, but it hasn't been the focus of mainstream reproductive rights organizations the way that opposing restrictions on abortion have been. So this distinction between advocating against state restrictions, that was the focus of Roe versus Wade, versus a full-out movement for the resources and social conditions required for reproductive freedom. And then the third implication of the focus on choice as a framework is that it has focused on the choice to have an abortion and often ignores other kinds of violations of reproductive freedom that are more likely to be experienced by women of color, like the punishment of pregnant women for various things, but in the late 80s, early 1990s, it was mainly punishment of pregnant women for drug use during pregnancy, and this was targeted primarily at cash-poor black women who smoke crack during pregnancy, with a whole host of racist stereotypes about them and their children that wasn't seen by the mainstream reproductive rights movement as connected to the struggle for abortion rights. Today, we can clearly see the connection as states pass fetal protection laws that treat fetuses as persons, that then means that having a stillbirth, having a botched abortion, and all other kinds of activity that's seen as harms to a fetus become one campaign, a legislative agenda against women's reproductive freedom. And so choice hasn't been a powerful enough tool or framework approach to address all of these kinds of barriers to reproductive freedom that women are experiencing. And as I mentioned on the other panel, a reproductive justice approach would be a far better one and is gaining more and more traction, largely as the result of organizing by Black women and other women of color.
Thank you. So about the Hyde Amendment, it's one of the consequences of the election. Repealing the Hyde Amendment was a plank in the Democratic platform. Mm-hmm. And there was actually an incipient campaign that was ramping up.
Yeah.
Hillary talked about it, right? Hillary advocated for repealing the Hyde Amendment, which was a big step considering Barack Obama had said it's the status quo, and so many Democrats had said it was the status quo. But it was just starting before the election.
Well, and also the Affordable Care Act could have included universal coverage for abortion, and it didn't. So there are these...
And it still got demagogued as expanding access to abortion, which is interesting, right? It did not actually forestall the politics of abortion affecting the Affordable Care Act, since it got to the birth control piece of it anyway.
Exactly.
The other thing I'll mention is, the demographics of who has abortions today are very interesting and concerning along the lines that you're talking about. So we know the abortion rate is dropping very noticeably. What's less obvious out there is that it's dropping into abortions by lower socioeconomic and women of color because of lack of access to reliable, long-lasting birth control. And we know from controlled experiments in Missouri and in Colorado that if women are given access to the LARCs, they will choose them, and the abortion rate really plummets. So I think people haven't adequately focused on the real change in the demographics of who manages to avail themselves of the abortion right. Erin?
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to be on the stage with you folks. Learned so much from your work. I, as not a historian, but rather as a journalist, I want to sort of bridge question one and also the present day. I've been thinking a lot about past and future and present criminalization of women who have abortions. So some of you may remember that during the presidential campaign, my former colleague Chris Matthews, in an interview with Donald Trump, pressed him to say, if abortion is made illegal, what would be the punishment for a woman? And he said, at first he tried to kind of not answer it, and then eventually he said, the answer is there has to be some kind of punishment for women. What was interesting was how uncritically the vehement follow-up from the anti-abortion movement was accepted, which is, for example, Trump doesn't understand the pro-life position because he's not pro-life. No pro-lifer would ever want to punish a woman who's chosen abortion. We invite a woman, this is from the March for Life Legal Defense Fund. We invite a woman who has gone down this route to consider paths to healing, not punishment. Trump actually put out 3 statements that day, thus keeping me very busy. And the final statement that he said was, the woman is a victim in this case, as is the life in her womb. The doctor or any other person performing this legal act upon a woman would be held legally responsible, not the woman. And of course, this idea that the anti-abortion movement is very interested in the protection of women from a predatory abortion industry is part of the rationale of the Texas law and many of the other laws that we're seeing, but in particular the Texas law that made it to the Supreme Court and was struck down as that being a pretext. So of course, I was interested in both the past and the present of whether this is true, that women will not be prosecuted, and in fact, their allegation is that women were not prosecuted before Roe, so then they never will be in the future. Okay, it is true that primarily doctors were prosecuted throughout history, and Jim, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but that there was a sort of conversation among women about how to access abortion, whether it was to self-induce or to using herbs, using more violent, more dangerous methods, that women talked to each other about where to find doctors who would be willing to provide this, and that depending on their access to those doctors, they did or didn't find the abortion that they were seeking. But I also think it's not so simple to say that back then women were never treated like they were perpetrators, because first of all, in many of the cases that were brought, women were dead. So this was they were being brought on murder charges or being an accessory to the death of this woman. And then once more doctors started to be prosecuted, you actually saw doctors, in the Journal of American Medicine, this is in the late 19th century, they had initially said that they wanted doctors to be prosecuted for providing abortions, but once people started really going after respectable doctors, they said, this was an editorial in the Journal of American Medicine, the American Medical Association, forget the moral lectures, hand them over to the police. And in the case where women did survive, they were often dragged in front of court cases to testify about their sexual activity, which obviously in the pre-Roe era was deeply stigmatized. Their bodies, they were subject to invasive exams as proof, as evidence. They were, if not always thrown in jail, they were definitely subject to dehumanizing treatment. And I think another misconception is that the history will necessarily tell us what will happen if abortion is outlawed or as it is already increasingly restricted despite whole woman's health, because certain things have changed. For example, Dorothy mentioned the feticide laws, laws that explicitly protect actions against the fetus and may not include language that exempts women from prosecution, which we're going to talk about in a second. In many cases, don't.
Women are being prosecuted.
Yes, and that's what I want to talk about.
Go on, sorry.
Yeah, no, please.
Yeah.
I covered the Purvi Patel case, so a few things are different. Jim, you mentioned that they didn't really talk about the fetus in the past. This was not a moral issue. Well, of course, if not the law on whole woman's health, many of the laws have involved trying to get women to contemplate the personification of the fetus, to look at the ultrasound. Carol mentioned, these specific laws that involve indexing the parts of the fetus, taking a printout of the ultrasound, being read language. I believe in South Dakota that the fetus is a whole and separate person with constitutional rights before having an abortion, being forced to wait sometimes 3 days, make multiple visits. That is all meant to make a woman contemplate that what she is doing is killing. The rise of ultrasound technology in social media and earlier and earlier sort of details about conception, I think might make it likelier that women would be prosecuted for abortion because there is so much more discourse about the humanity of the fetus now. So they can no longer argue, for example, that the woman didn't know what she was doing. In some ways, access to illegal abortion is easier than it was in the past because you now have groups like Women on Web that mail women a drug that is basically half of the protocol that you would get if you went to a doctor's office and had a medical abortion. This is now something that people order on the internet, including in the United States. And so what I wrote at the time that Trump made these comments, and something that I'm going to be grimly watching as we move forward, is how women are already being prosecuted. So some of you may be familiar with the case of Purvi Patel, who lived in Indiana, where abortion is technically legal, and of course, which was presided over our current vice president, by our current vice president, Mike Pence. Purvi Patel ordered pills from the internet to end her pregnancy and went to a hospital because she was hemorrhaging. She said that she thought that she was 10 to 12 weeks pregnant. It seems that she was closer to 25 weeks pregnant. So she was charged with feticide and neglect of a dependent. She was sentenced to 30 years, of which 10 were suspended. I actually interviewed the prosecutor in this case, and I wanted to understand, because she had been charged under this feticide law that had been passed in Indiana. By the way, Planned Parenthood didn't really oppose it at the time. It was a law where after a pregnant bank teller in a robbery had been shot and killed, and there wasn't a separate charge for the fetus. So here is what Ken Cotter, the prosecuting attorney of St. Joseph's County, said about why he was prosecuting this woman for ending her pregnancy. He said, "There are certain requirements that the legislature wants to make sure that you go through before an abortion is sanctified by society. If you don't go through those procedures, the legislature has determined that that's a crime." And he also said a more accurate definition of the feticide law would be unlawful termination of pregnancy. And when activists told me that getting an abortion in St. Joseph's County, home to Notre Dame, was something that involved this kind of invasive walking through protesters, going through all of Indiana's quote-unquote informed consent laws and waiting periods and so on, and certainly not late in pregnancy, the other prosecutor said, people can get abortions without a lot of people knowing. So one final way in which we can't misunderstand history to say that women won't be subject to criminalization in the future is that the apparatus of surveillance is so much more sophisticated now. One of the ways that they were able to build their case against Purvi Patel was that they used her text messages with a friend. And it included her talking about when she knew she was pregnant, for example. And they used her search history to show that she had looked at women on web, which gives women information about safely ending their pregnancy if they don't have access to a legal abortion. Her charge was later reduced. She pled guilty. Her feticide charge was reduced, but by that point she had spent 3 years in prison. So she got off relatively easy, but lost 3 years of her life. And it's definitely worth noting that of the women who have been prosecuted under the feticide charge in Indiana, all of them are women of color, specifically Asian women. So I think as we think about, and there have been prosecutions of black women for both for feticide involving drug use, but also involving women who were trying to end their pregnancies. So I think one difference that we have now that we didn't before is a more developed system of criminalization and mass incarceration. We also have, as Linda mentioned, a more bifurcated system of access to contraception, even more than before, I would argue. And if for example, the benefit in the Affordable Care Act that gives access to long-acting reversible contraception is overturned, I think you're also likely to have less sympathy for women seeking abortions, because it's those women. It's like, why couldn't you get birth control? Now you can get an IUD. So I think that that's actually in some ways going to marginalize and stigmatize women who turn to these options even more.
Thank you, Erin. I will deem your answer to have also answered the question of what lies ahead.
Double duty.
And maybe turn to that. Carol?
Well, may I say something about punishment first?
About
punishing women, because you looked at prosecuting women, but and gave these cases, which are certainly the case. I think that women are, if not prosecuted, are punished, not by the criminal law, but by the procedures they have to go through to get an abortion. Mm-hmm. It's all meant to induce guilt, and all the things that they say are that happen when you have an abortion: remorse, guilt, suicidal thoughts. Well, they are, to the extent that those come about at all, they come about by the regulations themselves. You are encouraged to think of the fetus as a child. You have to, and what we do to teenage girls, not in New York, but in 40 other states where they have to go to court before they can get permission for an abortion, where they're asked by the judge about their sex life, about their, and I just thought of one other sort of punishing thing. 3 states in the mandatory ultrasound field had requirements that for a vaginal ultrasound. And so as a student of mine said, that's not nothing. And there was such an outroar in Virginia that they repealed it. And there's a nice Doonesbury cartoon where the doctor is standing at the end of the surgical table, and he says, with this wand, I thee rape. And what is that? I mean, so we have a lot of punishment already, if not prosecution, which I think is part of the point.
We have both.
Yeah, no, I mean, that reminds me of the old slogan early in the abortion rights movement, abortion on demand, which was linked to 24-hour free childcare. Those were the two parts of that sign. And the abortion on demand slogan came about in response to the early reform laws that required, for instance, the law in Georgia that was struck down in Doe against Bolton, the companion case to Roe, required a woman to satisfy 5 doctors that she fit the characteristics for which abortion was going to be permitted in the state of Georgia. So the abortion on demand meant I shouldn't have to jump through those kind of hoops. But as the kind of backlash to feminism that the earlier panel that Linda Gordon discussed rose, it came to seem like a very strident, kind of over-the-top slogan, but actually it was just a response to what you're talking about. So who wants to take their hand at the way forward? What's the likely? Dorothy, would you like to? What happens next?
If we ask, what do we need in a movement that will actually make women's health and humanity seem important again? I think that, as I've said before, the reproductive justice movement that doesn't rely on an individual choice framework and doesn't rely on just looking at opposing restrictions on abortion, but sees the human right to abortion on demand, to the human right to the state funding abortion, just like it should fund all health care and other conditions and resources needed for people to flourish in our society. Reproductive justice does such a better job of that because it links reproductive freedom to social justice. And for one thing, it allows for a bigger base of support because it answers some of the tensions we talked about on the first panel, as well as those I mentioned here, and the tension between not seeing restrictions on pregnant women as linked to abortion. As I said, that was a failure of the mainstream reproductive rights movement, not to see those as connected. Now it's clear how connected they are. But reproductive justice does away with that tension and therefore allows for a bigger base of support for the right to abortion on demand. It also, as I was mentioning on the prior panel, allows for coalitions with other social justice movements that are advocating for radical systemic change. So the movement for Black lives, movement for environmental justice, movement for universal health care, movement to abolish prisons, all of these are seen as connected to the fight for reproductive freedom. And then it provides a better moral foundation, I think, for advocating for the right to abortion because it's not based on an individual woman's choice, which is so easy to attack as just something women want, that's frivolous, or something that it isn't as important as the human life of the fetus. But instead, it's based on the human right to health care, to dignity, to being treated as a full human being, to equality of citizenship. And that is a much stronger moral foundation for the right to abortion. So my view of what we need going forward is to really take seriously the reproductive justice movement and the framework that Black women feminists and other women of color have advocated as a substitute for the choice framework.
Thank you. So Carol, you talked about the whole women's health decision from last June, which of course looked at a phony claim that these restrictions on the operation of the clinics were for the purpose of women's health, and the court thankfully saw through that. But as you suggested, I think that's only one category of abortion restrictions that are out there now, and the other category, which is being litigated actively right now, are restrictions that are put in for the name of protecting the fetus. So we have the 20-week bans. We have the law in Texas that now has been stayed by a district court judge, but it's hard to have a lot of hope for the Fifth Circuit when that goes up on appeal, that requires fetal remains to be treated as you would the remains of a fully born person, and so on. So what's your sense of the future of those kind of restrictions?
After Whole Women's Health, I think there was great optimism that those restrictions would be put to a much harder test, and you'd actually have to show that they were related. I think that is
Related to?
Related to women's health, that having a doctor with privileges would really make a difference. And as you said, the court said abortion is so safe you don't have to. I think that we're ready. We should be expecting an avalanche of unconstitutional laws to come forth from the state legislatures, emboldened by the Trump-Pence administration. And what's interesting is that you can enact unconstitutional laws. I mean, in some countries you can't. You have to have it vetted first by the Attorney General. Is there anything in here that's...
That wouldn't help us.
Yeah. You have to recuse yourself from every law. Yeah, right. I keep forgetting where we are. True. But so there are, I mean, the law and the creativity of the laws is unbelievable. And Indiana is like a leader. They have a new one. There's also a prenatal anti-discrimination act. So you can't have an abortion on the grounds of fetal anomaly or race or
It's a
sex.
race and sex
Yes.
selection,
So
right?
the idea is not only are you a killer, but you're killing the most vulnerable, the one that we have federal legislation to protect in any other circumstance, as if it were involving persons. So that I think there's going to be a lot of those. I think they're going to absorb a huge amount of advocacy time to swat down while the court is formulating itself. There's a new one in Indiana on prenatal hospice care. And it's more diabolical than it even sounds, because it was started by nurses who for women who knew they were going to a stillbirth, and somewhere they could go while they were waiting for the procedure that would deliver the child. And so they revised that law to say you can, and so it's just a nice room and people and counselors and stuff, but they revised it to say anyone who's having an abortion cannot use this. So that it's as though if you want to suffer through, it's just another little piece. As is...
Well, it all goes to stigma, right?
Yes,
State-imposed
it all goes
stigma.
to stigma. We have a place for women whose fetuses are going to die, but not you, not you. And so, and I think that we need journalists to be on top of everything and tell us every minute what's happening. And I think my own view for how to go forward is by more talk and more bravery by women who have had or who have thought about having abortions. And it's amazing to me, I teach a course on abortion, and several times students have come back, their parents looked at their material, their mothers looked at their material, and then confided to their daughters that, in fact, they had had an abortion. And it was just in the family, a secret. So there's a woman named Lindy West who started a movement called Shout Your Abortion. And that's fine, but I'm not a shouting kind of person. So I think mention, talk to, because I think one of the things that is not understood is who they are. And this takes us back to punishment. I would actually possibly be bold enough to say, I think we should start arresting women who have abortions. And on the idea of, let's get rid of the draft exemptions during the Vietnam War and see what happens to the war. I mean, let's give women agency for saying they actually know what an abortion is and what it does, and not that they're too stupid to understand. Now, in the current environment, this could backfire badly.
Maybe
But-
if upper middle class white women could volunteer to be arrested, because I fear that the people who would be arrested were the ones who would not get out.
That's right. We have to have a list of people ready to go.
Yeah.
And I think, as we saw, people willing
It's a
to
little
be
scary
arrested.
to think about.
And go ahead.
I just want to give
Yeah,
Jim the
right.
last word from the centuries of history that you've seen that have brought us to this freighted moment of 2017.
Well, historians are notoriously bad at,
Wow.
we have a difficult time figuring out what happened. And what's going to happen, I don't know. I certainly think one of the keys to what will happen is the continued health framework and broadening that. These decisions have always been made, whether we like it or not, whether we wish it were different, they've always been made in the name of who should be allowed to do what to whom in the name of medicine. And that is likely to be the framework that is retained, which makes the health situation similar. As to a lot of these other things, what frustrates me, looking back at the centuries, is the fact that abortion rates have actually altered very little through U.S. history. Historical demographers can demonstrate that obviously abortions rise and fall in absolute numbers with the population and with different subsets of the population, but it has been an amazingly consistent part of American life. If you take abortions as a function of all pregnancies, that is, how many abortions for how many pregnancies. That really hasn't changed much since 1850 probably, you're safe to say. It hasn't really changed much, which means there's a silent tolerance for women making these decisions. And what's frustrating is the somewhat cynical politicization that makes it impossible for that silent tolerance to express itself in a democratic or majoritarian way. And we are ultimately a democracy, and so what needs to happen, it seems to me, is that kind of tolerance has to be brought up. There has to be a way to do that, has to fight constantly against these N of one gotcha type laws, which are utterly symbolic. When abortion was illegal for the years from 1880, let's say, until the late 60s, those laws were almost never enforced. In some states, they were literally never enforced. They're utterly symbolic laws, and the abortion rates remained the same in those states. A few states, they were enforced. Most of the time when they're enforced only when a death occurred, as Aaron said. So that they function as a kind of malpractice indictment in advance. You can do this if you want, but if the woman dies, we're going to haul you into court.
Right.
But there was this kind of silent tolerance, and somehow there has to be a way to bring that volume up. And I think the best bet to do that is within a health framework, since that's the way it's thought.
And if I could just underscore that, I mean, that was a malpractice regulating the profession, but what happens, I think the question moving forward for these women who feel that this is their best option is what happens when there is no provider? When the provider is the woman herself. Well, in certain states we're seeing that the woman herself, it is enforced against her.
Yeah. I want to thank the panel. Valerie's telling us the lunch bell is ringing. Okay, I have to go catch a flight now.
Thank you, everyone.
Scared to feel the
We'll meet
time.
back here promptly at 1:45 after lunch to hear from our center's chairwoman, our scholarly advisory board, Alice Kessler-Harris. She'll give us a sneak peek of our massive open online course, followed by a stellar lineup. Come back at 1:45.